hearing will be added, and it will be up to the committee whether we take the course of introducing legislation, and then if we want it on the January 15th primary date, if that stands, there's some time constraints, so we have to get it through the legislature in a very quick fashion, unlike what has been occurring on the budget. And but there is that potential, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow up real quick, I'd like to thank you guys for having us here today, and we do hope that you guys will act on this. Again, as I said earlier, this whole idea of a cleanup amendment isn't too spicy or star-studded for a lot of people, but I think if you did introduce this amendment, it would go a long ways to making our Constitution more efficient and government more efficient.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to call John Axe from the Citizens for Michigan Committee up to testify.
Thank you, Senator. And I want to particularly thank your committee for doing something that when we completed our work last fall, we hoped might occur. That is, you are actually discussing and reviewing some of the changes that we recommended needed to be considered in the next couple of years. I'd especially like to thank Bill Ballinger, who I think has done perhaps more than anyone else, along with Tim Skubik, for keeping this particular issue alive and under discussion. And both of the students in his class who testified here today have indicated that I think some very thoughtful consideration has occurred about some of these issues. I just briefly reviewed your first draft of the resolution, and I think that I can speak for the Citizens for Michigan saying that these are the kinds of cleanups that we mentioned as probably being desirable. We didn't know that someone would actually introduce them as a separate item. We just meant to have them on the table so they could be considered, and you're obviously doing that, and we appreciate that very much. Our organization, as I think you may know, worked for about 3 years putting together the report that we did. It was a voluntary organization. We formed a nonprofit corporation. There were 20 board members, and we had about 26 other people who worked on various provisions and studied them during the course of the 3 years. And our final report is a result of that. I've given a copy of that to Senator McManus. Senator Jacob would be glad to give you one if you like. And I would say that it speaks for itself, but I think I'd like to mention there are certain highlights that we were particularly concerned about. A number of people asked us, why did you bother? Yes?
Excuse me, I want to apologize in advance. Our caucus chair need to be back in Lansing at 1:30.
Okay.
We do have a staff person that's here who can stay here during your testimony. And I'm very, very sorry, but I was here on time, and I'm so sorry that I have to leave.
Well, that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, got you. We'll get you on videotape so I can be able to review everything that you said.
All right,
So
fine.
I want to apologize.
That's perfectly okay. I understand about having to get back for folks.
Yep,
Thank you
thank
for
you.
being
We'll
Okay.
excuse her.
The recommendations we made were based upon a concern, which I think Bill Ballinger and some of his students have already brought up, that there may be a little too much now in the Michigan Constitution. It is useful to, when evaluating the federal and the state constitutions, to remember that the federal Constitution is a provision which grants to the federal government certain powers, ultimately decided upon by the United States Supreme Court. State constitutions, incidentally, all of the remaining powers that aren't granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. And where they're reserved to the states is with the legislature, subject to whatever limitations are placed in the state constitution. So that a state constitution even though there are often grants of power in state constitutions, are really intended as a limit on legislative power in the state legislature. Maybe that's why Alabama has such a long constitution. They were not particularly willing to let the legislature do too much. The background, I guess, has changed a good deal since 1961 and 62. Recently, someone was quoted in Lansing as having said that, well, things were a lot different in 1961 and 62, and therefore there's certainly no need for a constitutional convention. Our organization did not recommend to the legislature that the legislature place the constitutional convention on the ballot. That is going to occur automatically in 2010. We recommended that there were a lot of areas that needed serious consideration, and we felt fairly strongly that there were some things that, if not, we recommended a yes vote for a constitutional convention. We didn't suggest that that needed to be done now. We thought it would be, since there's about 3 years in between there'd be enough time for the legislature to review these things and make some decisions as to whether there ought to be some changes. We had a lot of issues that we felt strongly about, and it's somehow difficult, I suppose, to say which, because people have asked me, well, which one is most important? I think there are a number of them that are very important. However, the most dramatic change that we think ought to seriously be considered relates to the ability of organizations from anywhere, and in the most recent experience, they seem to not even come from Michigan, who, with about $1 million, can place in front of the voters, by not going to the legislature, but simply by circulating petitions, propositions to amend the Constitution. Until 1972, I don't think anyone thought that it would be possible for someone to hire people to go out and circulate petitions and put them on the ballot. Before that, all of the, and incidentally, when this was put in the Constitution in 1961 and 62, and approved by the voters in 1963, nobody had ever done that, nor did anybody think you could. The United States Supreme Court has since ruled that it is entirely legal for you to hire people to do that sort of thing. And I think that has changed the political landscape a great deal. And for instance, if you would like to consider this, nobody's ever done it, but you could. If you had $1 million, and that's about what it took SOS to try to get it on the ballot the last time, their only problem was that some of the people they hired were not very careful, and they had 3 and 4 people sign the same petition, and they were thrown out for that reason. But had that not occurred, they would have had a very far-reaching, and I think incidentally quite damaging, proposal stuck on our ballot in a relatively short period of time to be considered by people who had no prior discussion about it whatsoever. And they could have just as easily written an entirely new Constitution